The old clock on the wall showed 11 at night when Maria Gonzalez pushed her cleaning cart through the back door of the Belmont Concert Hall in Vienna, Austria. She had done this same thing every single night for 11 years, and her body knew every step without her mind having to think about it. The cart had one wheel that always made a squeaking sound, and Maria had grown so used to it that the silence felt strange on the rare nights when it did not squeak. The concert hall was one of the most famous places for music in all of Europe, and people came from every corner of the world to sit in its red velvet seats and listen to the greatest musicians play. But Maria never saw those people, and she never heard those concerts because her work only began when everyone else had gone home. Tonight had been a big night at the hall, and she could tell this by the mess that was left behind. There were programs scattered under the seats and empty wine glasses on the small tables in the lobby, and someone had spilled something sticky on the marble floor near the entrance. Maria did not mind the mess because it meant the concert had been a success, and a successful concert meant the hall would stay open and she would keep her job. She was 62 years old, and jobs were not easy to find for women her age, especially jobs that let her work alone in the quiet of the night. Maria started in the lobby as she always did, picking up the trash first and then mopping the floors. The marble was old and beautiful, with swirls of cream and gold running through it like rivers on a map. She had learned over the years exactly how much soap to use so that the floor would shine but not be slippery for the morning staff as she worked. She hummed softly to herself, an old song from her childhood that she barely remembered the words to anymore. The tune lived somewhere deep in her chest, and it came out whenever her hands were busy and her mind was free to wander. After the lobby was finished, Maria moved into the main hall where the audience sat during performances. This room always took her breath away, even after all these years. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds, and it rose so high above that she sometimes felt like she was standing at the bottom of the sky. Crystal chandeliers hung down like frozen waterfalls of light, though they were dimmed now to save electricity. Maria worked her way down each row of seats, picking up anything that had been left behind and wiping down the armrests with a damp cloth. She found all sorts of things in those seats over the years. Once she found a diamond earring worth more money than she made in a whole year, and she turned it into the lost and found, where it sat for 6 months before a woman finally came to claim it. Another time she found a love letter that someone had written but never given to the person it was meant for. She'd read it 3 times before putting it in the trash because there was no name on it and no way to return it. Tonight she found only the usual things: a few tissues and a broken pen and a child's hair ribbon that was pink with white dots on it. When Maria reached the front of the hall, she stopped, as she always did, to look at the stage there. It stood in the center under a single light that was always left on through the night. The grand piano, it was a Steinway, the most famous piano in all of Vienna, and it had been played by every great pianist of the last 100 years. The wood was black and so shiny that Maria could see her own reflection in it when she got close enough, but she never got close enough anymore, because there was a rule that cleaning staff were not allowed to touch the piano. Only the musicians and the special piano tuner who came once a week were permitted to lay their hands on those keys. Understood this rule, and she respected it, but that did not stop her from looking every night. She stood at the edge of the stage and looked at that piano the way a mother might look at a child she had to give away long ago. There was something in her eyes when she looked at it, something deep and sad and hungry that she never let anyone see during the daylight hours. Her hands would grip the wooden handle of her broom a little tighter, and her breathing would become a little slower, and for just a moment she was not Maria the cleaning lady anymore. She was someone else, someone from a different time and a different place, someone who knew what it felt like to sit at a piano like that and make music that could break hearts. But that moment never lasted long, because Maria had learned many years ago that it was dangerous to live in the past. The past was a country she had escaped from, and she could never go back, no matter how much her heart wanted to. So every night she would take one last look at the piano, and then she would turn away and continue her work. Tonight was no different from any other night until she heard voices coming from the backstage area. Maria froze with her mop in her hand and listened carefully. The hall was supposed to be empty at this hour, and she was supposed to be alone for a moment. She felt afraid because Vienna was a safe city, but bad things could happen anywhere. Then she heard laughter, young laughter, the kind that comes from people who have never known real trouble in their lives. She relaxed a little because she recognized that kind of laughter, and she knew it probably belonged to music students who had stayed late to practice this. That happened sometimes, and Maria did not mind as long as they did not make a mess for her to clean up. She went back to her mopping and tried to ignore the voices, but they were getting louder and coming closer. Soon she could hear footsteps on the wooden stage floor, and she looked up to see a group of young people walking toward the piano. There were 5 of them, 4 young men and 1 young woman, and they were all dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than Maria's rent for a month. The center of the group was a man she recognized, not personally but from the posters that hung all over the hall. His name was Victor Harman, and he was only 28 years old, but he was already being called the greatest pianist of his generation. Maria had seen his face 100 times on those posters and in the newspaper articles that were sometimes left behind in the seats. He was handsome in a sharp way, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that seemed to look down on everyone. Around him she had heard the other staff members talk about him, and none of them had anything nice to say. They said he was rude to everyone who was not rich or famous, and that he never said thank you or please, and that he treated the hall like it belonged to him. Alone, Maria had never spoken to him, and she never planned to, because people like Victor Harmon did not speak to people like her. She kept her head down and continued mopping, hoping they would not notice her there in the shadows at the edge of the stage. But luck was not on her side tonight. Victor Harmon had been born into a family where music was not just a passion but a requirement. His father had been a conductor and his mother had been an opera singer, and there was never any question about what Victor would do with his life. He started piano lessons at the age of 3 and gave his first public concert at the age of 7. By the time he was 15, he had won every young musician competition in Europe, and by 20 he was performing at the most famous concert halls in the world. Success had come so easily to him that he had forgotten it was something that needed to be earned. He walked through life expecting doors to open for him, and they always did, because talent like his was rare and people were willing to forgive a lot of bad behavior for a chance to hear him play tonight. Victor had stayed late at the Belmont Concert Hall because he was preparing for a very important concert that would happen in 2 weeks. It was a charity event to raise money for young musicians from poor families, and all the most important people in Vienna would be there. Victor did not actually care about poor young musicians, but he knew that the concert would be good for his reputation. His manager had told him that several famous record producers would be in the audience, and this could lead to a big recording deal. So he practiced for hours after the regular audience had gone home, playing the same difficult passages over and over until his fingers ached. His students had come to watch him practice because they worshipped him the way young people often worship those who have what they want. They laughed at all his jokes and agreed with everything he said, and never told him when he was being cruel. This was not good for Victor, but he did not know it, and no one around him was brave enough to tell him. When Victor finally stopped practicing and stood up from the piano bench, he was in a strange mood. He felt restless and bored and a little bit mean, the way a cat feels when it has been inside too long and wants something to chase. That was when he noticed the old cleaning woman standing at the edge of the stage with her mop and bucket. She was trying to be invisible. He could tell, with her head down and her shoulders hunched as if she wanted to disappear into the shadows. Something about her annoyed him, though he could not have said exactly what. Maybe it was the way she stood so still, or the way she seemed to be watching the piano when she thought no one was looking, or maybe Victor was just in the mood to make someone feel small, because making others feel small was the only way he knew how to feel big. He nudged one of his students with his elbow and nodded toward the cleaning woman. The student looked and then looked back at Victor with a questioning expression. Victor smiled in a way that was not kind and began walking toward the edge of the stage. His students followed behind him like baby ducks following their mother, curious to see what he would do. Maria heard them coming and she gripped her mop handle tighter, but she did not look up. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with important people was to make yourself invisible and wait for them to pass. But Victor Harmon did not want to pass. He wanted to play. He stopped just a few feet away from her and looked down from the stage with his arms crossed over his chest. Cleaning woman was short and her hair was gray and pulled back in a tight bun, and her hands were rough from years of hard work. She wore a simple blue uniform that had been washed so many times it was almost gray, and her shoes were the practical kind that nurses and waitresses wear. Victor could not imagine what her life must be like, cleaning up after other people night after night, and the truth was he did not want to imagine it. People like her existed in his world only as background, like furniture or wallpaper, there to serve a purpose but not worth thinking about. He cleared his throat loudly and waited for her to look up. Maria had no choice now, so she raised her eyes and met his gaze. What Victor saw in those eyes surprised him. For just a moment there was no fear there, and no admiration either, just a kind of tired patience, like she had seen his type before and knew exactly what he was. But Victor pushed that thought away because it made him uncomfortable. He put on his most charming smile, the one he used for newspaper interviews and television appearances. The smile did not reach his eyes, but most people never noticed that you're there, he said in a voice that was friendly on the surface but had something sharp underneath. You look so serious standing there in the dark, watching us like a ghost. His students laughed because they knew they were supposed to laugh. Maria said nothing, and her face showed nothing. This bothered Victor more than he wanted to admit, so he tried again. I was just thinking, he continued, you must hear so much beautiful music working in a place like this. All the greatest pianists in the world have played on this stage. He paused for effect, and then added, but I wonder, do you even understand what you are hearing, or is it all just noise to you? One of his students, a young man with red hair and an eager face, laughed louder than the others. Another student, the young woman, looked slightly uncomfortable, but she did not say anything to stop what was happening. Maria still did not speak, and this was making Victor angry. Now he was used to getting reactions from people. Whether those reactions were praise or fear or admiration, silence was the one thing he did not know how to handle. He decided to push harder to see what would make this strange old woman break. Tell me, he said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage so that he was looking almost directly down at her. Have you ever played a piano in your life? Do you even know which end the sound comes out of? More laughter from his students. Maria's jaw tightened. just slightly, but still she did not respond. She was thinking about all the things she could say, all the truths she could tell him that would wipe that smile off his handsome face, but she had kept her secrets for so long that silence had become a habit. She could not break Victor, was enjoying himself now because he mistook her silence for weakness. Turned to his students with a theatrical gesture toward the piano behind him. "What do you think?" he said loudly enough for Maria to hear every word. "Should I give our audience of one a private concert? It is probably the closest she will ever get to real culture." The young woman student shifted her weight from one foot to the other and finally spoke up. "Victor, maybe we should just go. It is getting late." But Victor cut her off with a wave of his hand. He was not finished with his game. Yet he walked back to the piano and sat down on the bench with exaggerated elegance. His fingers hovered over the keys as he looked back at Maria with that cruel smile still on his face. "Any requests?" he called out to her. "What would you like to hear? Perhaps a simple nursery rhyme is more your speed." And then he said the words that would change everything. The words that would echo in this concert hall for years to come. He said them lightly, carelessly, like a match being tossed onto dry grass without any thought of the fire it might start. "I know," Victor said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Play something funny. That is what you need. Something funny to make you smile while you mop the floors." He began to play a silly, childish tune, hitting the keys harder than necessary and making faces like a clown. His students laughed and clapped like this was the funniest thing they had ever seen. But Maria did not laugh and she did not smile. She just stood there holding her mop and looking at the piano with those deep, tired eyes, and somewhere inside her chest, in a place she had kept locked away for 40 years, something began to wake up. The silly tune Victor played echoed through the empty concert hall and bounced off the painted ceiling where the angels looked down with their blank, peaceful faces. Maria stood perfectly still as the notes washed over her, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was anger, real and hot and alive, burning in her chest like a coal that had been buried under ash for decades. She had worked hard her whole life to feel nothing, to want nothing, to expect nothing from a world that had already taken everything from her. But this young man with his expensive clothes and his cruel smile had found a way. Through all her defenses he had done it without even trying, without even knowing what he was doing, and that made it worse. Somehow Victor finished his silly song with a dramatic flourish and turned on the piano bench to face her again. His students were still laughing, and one of them, the red-haired young man, decided to join in the game. "She probably does not even know who you are," the student said to Victor in a voice loud enough for Maria to hear. "She probably thinks you are just some random person playing around on the piano." Victor put his hand over his heart in mock offense. "You wound me," he said with fake sadness. "To think that anyone in Vienna would not know the name Victor Harman. It is impossible." The young woman student was looking more and more uncomfortable. Now her name was Alina, and she came from a family that was not rich, not like the others in Victor's circle. She was only here because she had won a scholarship based on her talent, and she knew what it felt like to be looked down on, but she was also afraid of losing her place in Victor's group. So she said nothing and hated herself a little for her silence. Victor stood up from the piano bench and walked back to the edge of the stage. He was not finished with Maria yet, because her silence was like a challenge to him. He was used to being the center of attention, and he did not understand people who did not react to him. "I have an idea," he announced to his students while keeping his eyes fixed on Maria. "Let us make this interesting." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, a thin leather thing that probably cost more than Maria earned in a week. He took out several large bills and held them up so everyone could see. "I will make a bet with all of you," Victor said with the confidence of someone who has never lost anything important. "I bet that our friend here has never touched a piano in her entire life." He paused and looked at Maria with raised eyebrows. "What do you say, old woman? Prove me wrong. Come up here and play something. Anything at all." His students exchanged glances, and a few of them laughed nervously. This was going further than they had expected, but no one wanted to be the one to stop it. Maria felt her heart beating faster, and her hands were shaking slightly where they gripped the mop handle. She told herself to stay quiet, to wait for them to get bored and leave, to protect the secret she had carried for 40 years. But another voice inside her was asking a different question. "How long?" That voice asked. "How long will you let people like him make you feel small? How long will you pretend to be nobody when you know exactly who you are?" Vic took her silence as proof that he was right. "You see," he said triumphantly to his students. "She cannot even answer because she knows I am right. People like her do not play piano. They clean up after people who do." The red-haired student laughed the loudest and added his own cruel comment. "She probably thinks Chopin is a type of food," he said. And the others laughed with him. Maria felt something shift inside her chest. It was like a door that had been locked for so long that she had forgotten it was even there. The lock was old and rusty, but it was starting to turn. Victor put the money back in his wallet and pulled out something else instead. A golden ticket with fancy writing on it. "Let me make this more interesting," he said, holding up the ticket so it caught the light. "This is an invitation to my charity gala in 2 weeks. The most important people in Vienna will be there." He waved the ticket like a little flag. "If you can play anything on this piano, anything at all that sounds like real music, I will personally invite you to attend as my guest of honor." His students gasped and giggled at the absurdity of the idea that the thought of this old cleaning woman in her faded uniform attending a fancy party with Vienna's elite was the funniest thing they had ever heard. "You will sit at my table," Victor continued, enjoying the shocked reactions of his students. "You will drink champagne and eat food prepared by the finest chefs, and everyone will wonder who is this mysterious woman who was invited by the great Victor Harmon." He was laughing now, really laughing, because to him this was all a wonderful joke. There was no risk in his bet, because he was absolutely certain he would never have to pay it. Maria set down her mop. The sound of the wooden handle hitting the floor was soft, but somehow it silenced all the laughter in the room. Everyone turned to look at her, and for a moment nobody moved. Victor's smile flickered just slightly because something in her face had changed. The tired patience was gone, and in its place was something he had never seen before, at least not directed at Hemet. Was the look of someone who had made a decision, someone who was done hiding, someone who had nothing left to lose. Maria wiped her hands on her uniform and took a step toward the stage, then another step. Another. Victor watched her approach with a mixture of amusement and something that might have been the very beginning of uncertainty. His students had stopped laughing now and were watching with wide eyes. The concert hall was so quiet that we could hear the old clock on the wall ticking away the seconds. Maria reached the steps that led up to the stage, 3 wooden steps worn smooth by thousands of feet over the years. She put her hand on the railing and paused. Elena, the scholarship student, found herself holding her breath, without knowing why. There was something happening here, something bigger than a mean joke played on a cleaning woman. Maria looked up at Victor, who was still standing by the piano with his golden ticket in his hand. Their eyes met and something passed between them, a message that Victor was too young and too proud to understand. "You want me to play," Maria said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried easily through the empty hall. These were the first words she had spoken since Victor and his students had arrived, and they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Recovered quickly and put his charming smile back in place. "Yes," he said with a wave of his hand. Come, show us what you can do. We are all very curious." His students snickered, but their laughter sounded nervous. Maria climbed the 3 steps slowly, not because she was weak, but because she wanted to feel each one beneath her feet. She wanted to remember this moment, this walk from one life back to another. The stage floor was solid beneath her worn shoes, and she could feel the slight vibration of her footsteps in the wood. She walked past Victor without looking at him and went straight to the piano. Up close, it was even more beautiful than she remembered. The black wood gleamed under the stage light, and the keys were perfect, white and black in their eternal pattern. She could smell the special oil that the tuner used, and beneath that the faint scent of old wood and history. Maria pulled out the piano bench and sat down. Her body remembered this position even after all these years, the straight back, the relaxed shoulders, the feet placed just so on the pedals below. If Darrell moved to stand where he could see her face, still holding his golden ticket, still sure that he was about to win his little game, his students gathered behind him like an audience at a show. They did not quite understand. Maria placed her hands above the keys, but she did not touch them. Yet she was looking at her own fingers, these hands that had scrubbed floors and washed dishes and carried heavy buckets for 40 years. They were not the hands of a pianist anymore, at least not on the outside. The skin was rough and there were calluses on her palms, and her knuckles were swollen from years of hard work. But inside those hands, in the muscles and bones and memory that lived beneath the skin, something was waking up, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. Victor cleared his throat impatiently. "Well," he said, "we are waiting. Play something funny if you like, or play something sad. Play anything at all if you can." Maria did not look at him. She was somewhere else now, somewhere far away from this concert hall in Vienna. She was in another concert hall, in another country, in another life, and she was 17 years old again, and the whole world was still full of possibilities. She lowered her hands to the keys and she began to play. To understand what happened in that concert hall in Vienna on that night, you must first travel back in time and across the ocean to a different country in a different world. Buenos Aires, Argentina, in the year 1976 was a city of beauty and terror. Living side by side, the streets were lined with elegant buildings and the cafes were full of people drinking coffee and talking about art and music and love. But underneath all that beauty there was fear, because the military had taken control of the government and people were disappearing in the middle of the night. They called it the Dirty War, though there was nothing clean about the other side. Either anyone who was suspected of disagreeing with the government could be taken from their home and never seen again. Families would wake up to find empty beds and no explanations and no one to ask for help. It was into this world that Maria Elena Vasquez was born, but for the first years of her life she knew nothing of politics or fear. She knew only music, because music had been in her family for generations. Her grandfather had been a tango musician who played in the dance halls of the city. Her grandmother had been a singer whose voice could make grown men weep. Her father, Alejandro, was a professor of music at the university, and her mother, Rosa, had given up her own career as a violinist to raise her children. Music was the air the Vasquez family breathed, and it was the language they spoke even when words failed to Maria. Elena was the youngest of 3 children, and from the moment she was born it was clear that she was special. She did not cry like other babies. She made sounds that were almost like singing. By the time she could walk, she was climbing onto the piano bench and pressing the keys with her tiny fingers. Her parents thought it was cute at first. The way children playing with pots and pans is cute, but then something happened that changed everything. One afternoon, when Maria Elena was 3 years old, her father was practicing a difficult piece by Chopin in the living room. It was a waltz he had been working on for weeks, trying to get the timing just right. Maria Elena was playing with her dolls on the floor nearby, or at least that is what her parents thought she was doing. When father finished and left the room to get a glass of water, he heard something that stopped him in the hallway. Someone was playing the waltz, not perfectly, not with the skill of an adult, but recognizably, correctly, with all the right notes in all the right places. Alejandro walked back to the living room and found his 3-year-old daughter sitting at the piano playing the piece she had just heard him practice. Her little fingers could barely reach the keys, but somehow she was making it work. Rose came running when she heard her husband shouting and found him standing in the doorway with tears streaming down his face. From that day forward, Maria Elena's life was dedicated to the piano. Her parents hired the best teachers in Buenos Aires, and she practiced for hours every day. By the time she was 5, she could play pieces that most students did not attempt until they were teenagers. By 7, she was performing at small concerts, and people were starting to talk about the child prodigy who played piano like an angel. At 10, she won her first national competition, and the newspapers called her the future of Argentine music. At 12, she performed at the Teatro Colón, the most famous opera house in all of South America. That night, the audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted for 15 minutes. Maria Elena stood on that stage in her white dress with her dark hair falling down her back, and she felt like the luckiest girl in the world. She did not know that darkness was coming. She did not know that her perfect life was built on ground that was about to collapse. The trouble started when Maria Elena was 16 years old. Her father Alejandro had always believed in justice and freedom, and he had started speaking out against the military government. First it was just quiet conversations with other professors at the university. Then it became letters to newspapers and speeches at small gatherings. Begged him to stop, to think of the children, to remember what happened to people who spoke too loudly. But Alejandro said he could not be silent while innocent people were being taken from their homes. He said that silence was the same as agreement, and he would not agree with evil. Maria Elena was too focused on her music to understand the danger her father was putting himself in. She practiced 8 hours a day preparing for her next big concert, a performance of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. This was the piece that had made her fall in love with the piano, the piece her father had been playing on that afternoon when she was 3 years old. It was complicated and emotional and required the kind of technical skill that most pianists spent their whole lives trying to achieve. Her teacher told her she was not ready, but Maria Elena was determined to prove him wrong. The concert was scheduled for October 5, 1977. At the Teatro Colón, tickets sold out in hours, and people were offering to pay 10 times the original price just to get inside. The newspapers wrote about it for weeks. This 17-year-old girl who was about to play one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. Maria Elena's face was on posters all over Buenos Aires, and strangers stopped her on the street to wish her luck. She had no idea that it would be the last concert of her life. 3 days before the performance, at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a loud knock on the door of the Vasquez home. Maria Elena woke up to the sound of her mother screaming and heavy boots on the wooden floors. She ran to her parents' bedroom and saw men in uniforms dragging her father out of bed. Alejandro was still in his pajamas, and he was shouting something, but Maria Elena could not understand the words. Rosa was clinging to his arm, trying to hold him back, but one of the soldiers pushed her and she fell against the wall. Maria Elena tried to run to her father, but her older brother grabbed her and held her back. The last thing Alejandro Vasquez said before they took him away was directed at his youngest daughter. "Remember the music," he said as they pushed him through the door. "Remember who you are." And then he was gone. They waited for him to come home. They waited for days and then weeks and then months. Rosa went to every government office and every police station and every church in the city asking for information. Nobody would tell her anything. Her husband had simply disappeared like so many others, swallowed up by the darkness that had fallen over their country. The concert was cancelled and Maria Elena stopped playing the piano. She could not bear to touch the keys that her father had taught her to love. Every note reminded her of him, and every reminder was like a knife in her heart. 3 months after her father was taken, Rosa made a decision. She sold everything they owned: the house, the furniture, the jewelry that had been in the family for generations. She burned all their documents and photographs. Because she had heard that the soldiers sometimes came back for the families of those they had taken, she changed their names and bought tickets on a ship to Europe. Maria Elena Vasquez died that night. At least on paper. In her place, a new person was born. A quiet girl named Maria Gonzalez, who had no past and no future and no music inside her anymore. The family settled in Vienna because Rosa had a distant cousin there who agreed to help them. They lived in a tiny apartment, and Rosa cleaned houses to pay the rent. Now Maria tried to go to school, but she could not concentrate, and eventually she dropped out. She took a job as a cleaning woman, like her mother, because it was work she could do without thinking. Years passed, and Rosa grew sick and died, still waiting for news of her husband that would never come. Maria's older siblings moved away and started their own families and slowly stopped calling, and Maria kept cleaning, night after night, year after year, in hotels and offices, and eventually in the Belmont Concert Hall. She never touched a piano again. She never listened to music if she could avoid it. She never told anyone who she really was or what she had lost until tonight. The piano keys were cold beneath Maria's fingers, and for a moment she could not remember how to begin. 40 years is a long time to be silent, and her hands felt strange resting on the instrument that had once been her whole world. Victor Harmon stood nearby with his arms crossed and that smug smile still on his face, waiting for her to fail. His students had gathered in a small group behind him, whispering to each other and trying not to laugh. They were all so young, Maria thought, so young and so sure of themselves. They had no idea what life could do to a person, how it could pick you up and throw you down and leave you wondering if you had ever really existed at all. Maria closed her eyes and tried to find the music inside herself. For so long she had kept it locked away in a room in her heart that she never visited. She had been afraid that if she opened that door even a crack, all the pain would come flooding out and drown her. But now, sitting at this piano with these cruel young people watching her, she realized something important. The pain was already there. It had always been there. Hiding from it had not made it go away. It had only made her smaller and quieter and more invisible. She thought about her father, Alejandro, and the last words he had spoken to her on the night they took him away. Remember the music, he had said. Remember who you are. For 40 years she had tried to forget, and for 40 years she had failed. The music was in her blood and bones and breath, and no amount of silence could make it disappear. Maria opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. She knew exactly what she was going to play. It was the piece she had been practicing for her concert at the Teatro Colon, the concert that never happened. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the same piece her father had been playing on that long ago afternoon when a 3-year-old girl had climbed onto the piano bench and changed the course of her own life. Victor shifted impatiently from one foot to the other. We do not have all night, old woman, he said with a sigh. Some of us have important things to do tomorrow. Maria did not respond, and she did not look at him. I was not in Vienna anymore. She was in Buenos Aires in 1977, and she was 17 years old, and her father was still alive, and the whole world was still full of music. She began to play. The first notes of the ballade are soft and questioning, like someone knocking on a door and wondering if anyone is home. Maria's fingers found them without thinking, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought could not. The notes rose up from the piano and filled the empty concert hall like water filling an empty glass. Victor's smile flickered. He had expected her to fumble, to hit wrong notes, to prove that she was exactly what he thought she was. Instead, the sound coming from the piano was something else entirely. It was not the playing of a cleaning woman who had never touched a piano before. It was the playing of someone who knew this music intimately, who had lived inside it and breathed it and loved it. The young woman student, Alina, took a step forward with her eyes wide and her mouth slightly open. She had studied at the conservatory for years, and she knew what she was hearing. This was not the playing of an amateur, this was the playing of a master. The ballade is divided into several sections, each with its own character and emotional color. The opening is gentle and sad, like a memory of something beautiful that has been lost. Maria played it the way she had played it 100 times in her parents' living room, with her father sitting in his chair listening with tears in his eyes. Then the music began to change, growing faster and more intense. This was the part that had always been the hardest for Maria, the part where emotion and technique had to work together perfectly or the whole thing would fall apart. But her fingers knew what to do. Even after all these years, they danced across the keys with a speed and precision that made Victor take a step backward. He had never heard anyone play like this, not even the famous pianists whose recordings he studied. There was something in the sound that was bigger than technique, something raw and real and alive. It was like watching someone tell a story, not with words but with pure feeling. The notes poured out of the piano, and they carried 40 years of silence with them. All the nights Maria had spent mopping floors and wishing she could play again. All the times she had stood in this very concert hall watching the piano and remembering what she had lost, all the grief for her father who had disappeared into the darkness and never come home. All of it was in the music now, released from the locked room in her heart and set free to flow. Victor's students had stopped whispering and were now sitting in the front row of seats. They did not remember deciding to sit down. It had just happened naturally, like their body knew before their minds did that something important was taking place. Yelena was crying, though she did not know why. The red-haired student who had laughed the loudest at the cleaning woman sat with his mouth open and his face pale. Even Victor had lost his smug expression and was now watching Maria with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The music reached its climax. A cascade of notes that sounded like a storm breaking over the ocean. Maria's hands flew across the keys and her whole body moved with a rhythm. She was not thinking anymore. She was just feeling, and the feeling was bigger than anything she had experienced in 40 years. And then slowly the storm began to come. The notes grew softer and slower, returning to the gentle sadness of the opening. This was the part that had always made Maria's father cry. The part where the music seemed to be saying goodbye to something precious. She played the final notes and let them hang in the air like leaves falling from a tree. The sound faded slowly, absorbed by the velvet seats and the high ceiling, and the silence of the empty hall. Maria lowered her hands to her lap and sat very still. She felt empty in a way that was not bad. Empty like a glass that has been poured out and is ready to be filled with something new. For a long moment nobody moved or spoke. The concert hall was so quiet that you could hear the old clock ticking on the wall and the faint sound of traffic from the street outside. Victor Harmon stood frozen in place with his face showing an expression his students had never seen before. He looked like a man who had just been told that everything he believed about the world was wrong. That golden ticket to his charity gala was still in his hand, but he seemed to have forgotten it was there. Finally Alina broke the silence. She stood up from her seat in the front row and began to clap. Her applause echoed through the empty hall. A lonely sound at first, but then the other students joined in soon. All 5 of them were on their feet, clapping and clapping with tears on some of their faces. Maria did not stand up to bow like she used to do at her concerts in Buenos Aires, just sat at the piano with her hands in her lap and looked at the keys that had just helped her find herself again. Victor walked slowly toward the piano. His expensive shoes made soft sounds on the wooden stage floor. When he reached Maria, he stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. All his clever words and his charming smile seemed useless. Now he had spent his whole life believing that he was special, that his talent made him better than other people, but he had just watched a cleaning woman play with more feeling and truth than he had ever managed in all his years of training. "Who are you?" he whispered, and his voice was so different from before. No longer mocking, but full of genuine wonder. Maria looked up at him with those deep, tired eyes. She thought about all the answers she could give him. She could tell him about Buenos Aires and the Teatro Colón and the night her father was taken away. She could tell him about the long years of silence and the pain of being nobody when she had once been somebody. But in the end she chose simpler words. "I am nobody now," she said quietly. "But once I was somebody's daughter who loved to play." Victor looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his face. It was like watching ice begin to melt. Slow at first, but then faster. He looked down at the golden ticket still clutched in his hand. Then he looked back at Maria, and for the first time since they had met he saw her as a real person, not as a cleaning woman or a joke or a prop for his amusement, but as a human being with a story he could not begin to imagine. He held out the ticket to her. "Please," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, "please come to the gala as my guest. Not because of the bets, but because I want you there." Maria looked at the ticket and then at Victor's face. She saw something there that she had not expected to see. Shame, real shame. The kind that comes when a person realizes they have done something wrong and cannot take it back. She reached out and took the ticket from his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Victor nodded and turned away quickly because there were tears in his eyes and he did not want anyone to see them. The clock on the wall showed past midnight, and the cleaning that Maria had been hired to do was still not finished, but somehow that did not seem to matter anymore. Something had changed in the Belmont concert hall that night. Something had changed in all of them. The days that followed that night in the concert hall were strange and quiet, for Mariusz went back to a small apartment in the old part of Vienna, where she had lived alone for the past 20 years. It was just 2 rooms with a tiny kitchen and a bathroom that sometimes had hot water and sometimes did not. The walls were painted a pale yellow that had faded over time, and there were cracks in the ceiling that looked like rivers on a map. Maria had never bothered to decorate much because she had always felt like a guest in her own life, someone who was just passing through on the way to somewhere else. The only thing of beauty in the apartment was a small photograph in a silver frame that sat on her bedside table. It showed a family standing in front of a grand house with flowering trees in the background. There was a man with kind eyes and a woman with dark hair and 3 children, 2 boys and a little girl. A little girl was holding a stuffed rabbit and smiling at the camera like she had never known a moment of sadness in her life. That little girl was Maria, or rather, she was Maria Elena, and the photograph was the only thing she had managed to save when her mother burned everything else. She had hidden it in a shoe on the night they fled Argentina, and she had kept it with her ever since. Sometimes she would look at it and try to remember what it felt like to be that happy, but the memory was like trying to hold water in her hands. It always slipped away before she could grasp it. On the morning after the concert hall, Maria woke up feeling different. There was something in her chest that had not been there before, a kind of lightness, like a bird that had been trapped in a cage and was finally stretching its wings. She made her coffee the way she always did and sat by the window watching the people on the street below. There was a mother pushing a stroller and an old man walking his dog and a group of students laughing about something on their phones. Normal life going on the way it always did, unaware that anything had changed. But something had changed, at least for Maria. She had played the piano for the first time in 40 years and she had not fallen apart. The pain had come, yes, wave after wave of it, but she had survived. She was still here, still breathing, still alive. Her cat Lucia jumped onto the windowsill and rubbed her head against Maria's hand. Lucia was old and gray and had been Maria's only companion for the past 15 years. Maria had found her as a kitten behind the concert hall. Hungry and cold and crying for her mother, she had taken her home and nursed her back to health, and they had been together ever since. Sometimes Maria thought that Lucia was the only one in the world who truly knew her. The cat had seen her cry on the anniversaries of her father's disappearance. She had been there on the lonely nights when Maria could not sleep and sat up until dawn thinking about everything she had lost. Lucia did not judge, and she did not ask questions, and she did not expect Maria to be anything other than what she was. Maria scratched behind the cat's ears and thought about what had happened with Victor Harmon. She still had the golden ticket he had given her, tucked into the drawer of her bedside table next to the photograph. The charity gala was in 12 days, and she had no idea if she would actually go. Part of her wanted to throw the ticket away and forget the whole thing had ever happened. That part of her was tired and scared and wanted to go back to being invisible. But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted something different. That part wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be Maria Elena again, even if only for one night. 3 days after the concert hall, something unexpected happened. Maria was at the grocery store buying bread and milk when she noticed a young woman staring at her from across the aisle. The woman looked familiar, but Maria could not place her at first. Then she remembered. It was Elena, the scholarship student who had been with Victor's group that night. Elena walked over slowly, like she was approaching a wild animal that might run away at any moment. She was holding a basket with vegetables and cheese, and her face was nervous but determined. "Excuse me," Elena said in a quiet voice. "I am sorry to bother you, but I wanted to talk to you." Maria looked at her without speaking and waited. Elena took a deep breath and continued. "I was there that night at the concert hall and I saw you play, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it." She paused and her eyes filled with tears. "I'd come from a poor family in a small town, and I got a scholarship to study music, and sometimes I feel like I do not belong here with all these rich students who that have had everything handed to them." Maria softened a little because she recognized something in this young woman, a hunger that went beyond wanting success. "When I saw you sit down at that piano," Elena continued, "when I heard you play, I realized something important." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I realized that music does not belong to rich people or famous people or people with the right connections. It belongs to anyone who truly loves it." Maria felt a lump forming in her throat. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Elena," the young woman said. "Elena Novak." Maria nodded slowly and looked at this girl who reminded her so much of herself at that age, full of dreams and determination and the belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. "Elena," Maria said. "What instrument do you play?" "Piano," Elena answered. "I have played since I was 6 years old, but I am not good enough. At least that is what Victor always tells me." Something flashed in Maria's eyes at the mention of Victor's name. "Victor tells you that you are not good enough," she repeated. Elena nodded sadly. "He says I have technique but no soul. He says people from backgrounds like mine can learn to play the notes, but we can never truly understand the music." Maria felt anger rising in her chest, the same anger she had felt on the night Victor had mocked her. How dare he tell this talented young woman that she was not good enough? How dare he make her feel small just because she did not come from money? "Listen to me," Maria said, and her voice was stronger now, more like the voice of the girl she used to be. "Victor Harmon knows nothing about what it means to truly understand music." Elena's eyes widened. "Music is not something you learn in expensive schools or from famous teachers," Maria continued. "Music is something you feel in your bones. It is the sound of your heart breaking and healing and breaking again." She took Elena's hand in her own rough, calloused hand. "You have more soul in your little finger than Victor has in his whole body. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." Elena started crying in earnest now, tears streaming down her face. In the middle of the grocery store, people were starting to look, but Maria did not care. She pulled the young woman into a hug and held her the way she wished someone had held her all those years ago. When Elena finally pulled back, she looked at Maria with something like hope in her eyes. "Will you teach me?" she asked in a whisper. "Will you teach me to play like you?" Maria was so surprised by the question that she did not know what to say. At first she had not taught anyone anything in 40 years. She had barely even spoken to anyone about music in all that time, but looking at Elena's eager face, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe this was why she had survived all those years of silence. Maybe this was why she had finally found the courage to play again. Maybe it was not just for herself, but for all the young musicians who needed to hear that talent did not come from money or from it came from the heart. "Yes," Maria said, and the word felt like a door opening. "Yes, I will teach you." Elena's face lit up with a smile so bright it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. She hugged Maria again and thanked her over and over until Maria had to gently push her away. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet the following week at Elena's apartment, where there was a small upright piano. As Maria walked home with her groceries, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she had a purpose. She felt like Maria Elena Vasquez was not completely dead after all. She was just sleeping, and now, finally, she was beginning to wake up. Victor Harmon had not slept well since the night in the concert hall. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cleaning woman sitting at the piano, with her rough hands and her faded uniformed, he heard the music she had played, that devastating Chopin ballade that had made him feel like a child pretending to be an adult. He had spent his entire life believing that he was special, that his talent set him apart from ordinary people, but watching Maria play had shattered that belief like a hammer through glass. We had played with more feeling in 5 minutes than he had managed in his entire career, and she had done it after 40 years of not touching a piano, after spending her nights mopping floors and cleaning toilets. If someone like her could play like that, what did it say about him and all his training, and all his expensive teachers and all his awards? Vic tried to distract himself by practicing for the charity gala, but nothing felt right in more. The notes that came from his fingers sounded empty and mechanical. He played the same passages over and over, but he could not find the soul in them. His manager called to check on the preparations, and Victor snapped at her so harshly that she hung up in tears. His students came for their lessons, but he cancelled them all, saying he was sick. He was sick, in a way, sick with something he had never experienced before. He was sick with Shaman. The 5th day after the concert hall, Victor found himself standing outside the Belmont Concert Hall at 2 in the morning. He did not know why he had come. His feet had simply carried him there while his mind was elsewhere. The building was dark except for a few lights in the windows, and the street was empty and quiet. Victor stood on the sidewalk looking up at the grand entrance where posters of famous pianists hung in glass cases. His own face was there among them, a photograph taken 2 years ago when he had performed Rachmaninoff to a sold-out crowd. He looked at his younger self in that photograph, so confident and proud, and he felt like he was looking at a stranger. A door opened at the side of the building, and Victor quickly stepped into the shadows. He watched as a figure emerged pushing a cleaning cart, the same cart with a squeaky wheel. It was Maria. She was wearing her blue uniform and her gray hair was pulled back in its usual tight bun. Victor watched her lock the door behind her and begin walking down the street. He should have let her go, should have stayed hidden and gone home to his expensive apartment, but something made him step out of the shadows and call her name. Maria stopped and turned around slowly when she saw who it was. Her face showed no surprise, only that same tired patience he had seen on the night they first met. Victor walked toward her with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground. He did not know what to say now that he was here. The clever words he used in interviews and conversations seemed stupid and useless. "It is late," Maria said when he reached her. "You should be home sleeping." Victor laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "I have not been sleeping much lately," he admitted. Maria studied his face for a moment, and she saw the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his jaw. He looked like a man who was fighting a battle inside himself and losing. "Walk with me," she said, and she began pushing her cart down the empty street. Fell into step beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the squeaky wheel of the cart and their footsteps on the pavement. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "I need to know," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I need to know who you really are." Maria did not answer right away. She kept walking, her eyes fixed on the street ahead, thinking about how much to tell him. "Does it matter?" she asked finally. Victor stopped walking and Maria stopped. "Yes," he said, and for once he was not performing or pretending. "Yes, it matters. I have spent my whole life thinking I've understood music, but I was wrong." He ran his hand through his hair and, with frustration, "I have played for presidents and royalty, and the most important people in the world, but I have never played like you played that night." His voice cracked slightly. "How did you do it? How did you make the piano sound like it was crying?" Maria looked at him for a long moment. She saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before, a genuine hunger for understanding. This was not the arrogant young man who had mocked her. This was someone who was lost and looking for a way home. She went side and began to speak. She told him about Buenos Aires and the flowering trees and the grandfather who played tango in the dance halls. She told him about her father Alejandro, who taught her to love music, and her mother Rosa, who gave up her own dreams so her children could have theirs. She told him about the teatro colon and the white dress and the standing ovation that lasted 15 minutes. She told him about the night the soldiers came and the last words her father ever spoke to her. She told him about the ship to Europe and the tiny apartment and the years of cleaning and silence. Listened without interrupting, and as Maria spoke he felt something breaking open inside his chest. He had never known suffering, not real suffering. His biggest problems had been bad reviews and cancelled concerts and sponsors who did not pay on time. He had lived his whole life wrapped in cotton wool, protected from the sharp edges of the world, and he had used that protection to look down on people like Maria, people who had actually lived and suffered and survived. When Maria finished speaking, the sky was starting to lighten in the east. They had been walking for hours, and Victor had not even noticed. He felt exhausted and raw, like someone had scraped away all his defenses and left him exposed. "I am sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate, but he did not know what else to say. "Sorry for what I said to you that night. Sorry for the way I treated you. Sorry for being so blind." Maria nodded slowly. "You were cruel," she said simply, "but you were also young and foolish, and those things can be forgiven." She looked at him with those deep, tired eyes. "The question is, what will you do now?" Victor did not understand what she meant. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You have a gift," Maria said. Real talent that could move people if you learned how to use it. She paused and chose her next words carefully. But talent without heart is just noise. It is like a beautiful instrument that no one knows how to play. Victor felt tears stinging his eyes and he did not try to hide them. How do I find it? He asked. How do I find the heart? Maria smiled for the first time since he had met her. It was a small smile. Tired and sad. But it was real. You stop performing for others and start playing for yourself, she said. You think about the people you have loved and the people you have lost, and you let that feeling flow through your fingers. She reached out and touched his hand briefly. Music is not a competition to be won. It is a conversation to be had. When you understand that you will be able to play. They had reached Maria's apartment building, a plain gray structure that looked nothing like the fancy places Victor was used to. She stopped at the entrance and turned to face him one last time. Go home, Victor Harmon, she said. Go home and think about what I have told you. She paused at the door. And if you want to make up for what you did that night, be kind to Ali. She has more talent than you know. Victor watched her disappear into the building and he stood there for a long time after she was gone. The sun was coming up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Victor had never watched a sunrise before. Not really. He had always been too busy or too tired or too focused on himself, but now he stood on this empty street in the poorest part of Vienna and watched the light spread across the sky, and, for the first time in his life, he felt small. Not small in a bad way, but small in the way that all humans are small when they stand before something beautiful and true. He had so much to learn, but for the first time he was ready to learn it. The video appeared on the internet 3 days before Victor's charity gala. It was uploaded by the red-haired student whose name was Thomas and who had laughed the loudest on the night Maria played. He had recorded the whole thing on his phone without telling anyone, and for days he had debated whether to share it. Part of him felt guilty because he knew Maria had not wanted to be filmed, but another part of him, the part that wanted attention and followers and fame, could not resist. He uploaded the video with the title, "Cleaning Lady Destroys Arrogant Pianist," and within hours it had been viewed 10,000 times. By the next morning it had reached 100,000 views. By the evening it was at 1 million, and climbing. The video showed everything. Victor's cruel jokes, the mocking laughter of his students, and then Maria's devastating performance. People watched as this gray-haired woman in a cleaning uniform sat down at one of the finest pianos in Europe and played Chopin like her life depended on it. Comments poured in from all over the world. This made me cry at my desk, wrote someone from New York. Who is this woman? Asked someone from Tokyo. She plays better than anyone I have ever heard. Victor Harmon should be ashamed of himself, wrote someone from London. News websites picked up the story and journalists began trying to find out who the mysterious cleaning woman was. The Belmont Concert Hall was flooded with calls asking for Maria's name and contact information. The hall's director was furious at first because he had not known about the late night incident, but as the video continued to spread he began to see an opportunity. A cleaning woman who played piano like a master was exactly the kind of story that could bring attention to the hall. He called Maria into his office and asked her to tell him everything. Maria was reluctant at first because she had spent 40 years hiding from the spotlight, but the director was kind and patient, and eventually she told him a little bit of her story. Not everything, not the details about her father and the dirty war, but enough for him to understand that she was someone special. The director contacted a journalist he knew at a major Austrian newspaper and arranged an interview. Maria agreed only because the journalist promised to be respectful and not to dig too deeply into her past. The article appeared 2 days before the gala with the headline, "The Piano Prodigy Who Disappeared." It told a carefully edited version of Maria's story, focusing on her talent and her years of silence without going into the painful details of why she had fled Argentina, but it was enough to spark curiosity around the world. Old concert programs from Buenos Aires were dug out of archives and posted online. Someone found a recording of Maria Elena Vasquez playing at the Teatro Colón in 1976 and uploaded it to the internet. Retired professor from the Buenos Aires Conservatory gave an interview saying he had taught Maria Elena when she was a child and had always wondered what happened to her. "She was the most talented student I ever had," the old professor said with tears in his eyes. "When she disappeared we thought she must have died like so many others during that terrible time." The story took on a life of its own, spreading from country to country and language to language. Received interview requests from television shows in America, Japan, Germany, and a dozen other countries. She turned them all down because she did not want to be famous and she did not want to relive her pain for entertainment. But there was one message that she could not ignore. It came in a letter delivered to the concert hall, a thin envelope with stamps from Argentina. Maria's hands trembled as she opened it because she recognized the handwriting on the address. It was her older brother Carlos, the one who had held her back on the night the soldiers took their father. Was 70 years old now and living in a small town outside Buenos Aires. He had seen the video and the newspaper articles, and he had spent 2 days tracking down how to contact her. The letter was short because Carlos had never been good with words. "Dear Maria Elena," it said, "I cannot believe you are alive. I have missed you every day for 40 years. Please write back. Your brother Carlos." Maria sat in her tiny apartment with the letter in her hands and cried. For the first time in years she had lost touch with her brothers. Decades ago, when the pain of remembering had become too much, she had convinced herself that they were better off without her, that she was a reminder of everything they had lost, but here was proof that she had been wrong. Carlos had not forgotten her, he had missed her, he still wanted her in his life. She wrote back that same night, a long letter full of everything she had not been able to say for 40 years. She told him about Vienna and her job and her cat Lucy. She told him about the night in the concert hall and the arrogant pianist who had accidentally set her free. She told him that she was sorry for disappearing and that she wanted to know him again. The letter went out in the morning mail and Maria felt lighter than she had in decades. Meanwhile, Victor Harmon was dealing with his own stigma. The video had made him look terrible and he knew it. Comments calling whom cruel and arrogant and privileged were everywhere he looked. His manager had called in a panic, saying that sponsors were threatening to pull out of the gala. Several famous musicians who were supposed to perform had sent messages saying they were reconsidering their participation. Victor could have fought back, could have given interviews defending himself or blaming Thomas for uploading the video without permission, but he did not. Instead, he released a short statement that surprised everyone. "I behaved badly and I am ashamed." The statement read, "Maria Gonzalez is a brilliant pianist and a remarkable woman. I was cruel to her and she responded with grace and beauty. I hope she will forgive me and I hope she will perform at the gala as my guest of honor." The statement did not fix everything, but it helped. Some of the sponsors came back and some of the musicians agreed to perform after Albert. More importantly, the statement reached Maria and she saw that Victor meant what he said. She called him that evening. The first time she had ever used the phone number he had given her. "I forgive you," she said simply. When he answered, Victor was silent for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was thick with emotion. "Will you come to the gala?" he asked. "Will you play?" Maria thought about it for a long time. She thought about her father and the music she had buried and the girl she used to be. She thought about Alina and the lessons they had started, and the joy she felt when teaching. She thought about Carlos, and the letter on its way to Argentina, and the possibility of being part of a family again. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I will come, and will you play?" Victor asked. Again Maria smiled even though he could not see it. "We will see," she said. "We will see." The charity gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Imperial Hotel, one of the oldest and most beautiful buildings in Vienna. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with gold and angel stables covered in white cloth were arranged around a small stage where a grand piano stood waiting. The guests were the richest and most powerful people in Austria, dressed in gowns and tuxedos that cost more than most people earned in a year. Maria stood at the entrance of the ballroom, feeling like she had stepped into another world. She was wearing a simple black dress that Alina had helped her choose from a second-hand shop. It was nothing fancy, but it fit her well, and she had added a silver necklace that had belonged to her mother. Her gray hair was loose for the first time in years, falling in soft waves around her face. Victor spotted her from across the room and came over immediately. He looked different than he had on the night they first met, less arrogant and more humble. There was something in his eyes that had not been there before, a softness that made him seem younger and older at the same time. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice. "I said I would," Maria replied. Victor offered her his arm and led her through the crowd toward the table at the front where the most important guests were seated. People stared and whispered as they passed, because everyone had seen the video and everyone knew who Maria was. Some of them looked at her with curiosity and others with admiration and a few with the kind of respect that is usually reserved for royalty. Maria kept her head high and her back straight, remembering the girl who had once walked across the stage of the Teatro Colón. That girl was still inside her somewhere, buried but not dead. The dinner was long and fancy with more courses than Maria could count. There were speeches about the importance of supporting young musicians and presentations about the scholarships that would be funded by the evening's donations. Victor spoke about his own journey, and for the first time he talked honestly about his mistakes. He talked about how he had let success make him cruel and how a cleaning woman had taught him more about music in one night than he had learned in years of training. When he said this, he looked at Maria and raised his glass in her direction. The audience applauded and Maria felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. She was not used to being the center of attention, at least not anymore. After dinner, the musical performances began. Students from the conservatory played pieces they had been practicing for months. Some were nervous and made mistakes, but others played beautifully, and Maria found herself moved by their passion. She thought about herself at that age, so full of dreams and so unaware of how quickly everything could change. Alina performed near the end of the program, playing a Debussy piece that Maria had helped her with. She played it wonderfully, with the kind of feeling that Victor had once said she did not have. Maria watched with tears in her eyes as this young woman she had come to care about showed everyone what she was capable of. When Lena finished and took her bow, the applause was loud and long. She looked at Maria and smiled, and Maria smiled back, proud as any mother could be. Then Victor took the stage and the room fell silent. "We have one more performer tonight," he announced. "Someone who many of you have seen in a video that has been watched by millions of people around the world." He paused and looked at Maria. Maria Elena Vasquez was once called the greatest young pianist in Argentina. 40 years ago she disappeared and the world thought she was lost forever. The audience murmured and shifted in their seats, but she was not lost. Victor continued. "She was here in Vienna, cleaning our concert halls and carrying her music inside her like a secret." He stepped aside and gestured toward Maria's table. "Tonight, I would like to invite her to play for us." If she is willing, Maria's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had known this moment might come, but she had not decided whether she would accept all those people looking at her. All those eyes expecting something extra was terrifying, but then she thought about her father and the last words he had spoken to her. Remember the music. He had said, "Remember who you are." She had spent 40 years forgetting, and now it was time to remember. Maria stood up slowly and the room erupted in applause. She walked toward the stage, feeling like she was floating, like her feet were not quite touching the ground. Victor helped her up the steps and she saw that his eyes were wet with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." Maria nodded and walked to the piano. She sat down on the bench and looked out at the sea of faces before her. These were not her people, not the poor workers and refugees she had spent her life among. These were the rich and powerful, the ones who had never known hunger or fear or loss. But music did not care about such things. Music was a language that everyone could understand, if they were willing to listen. Maria placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes. She thought about her father sitting in his chair listening to her practice. She thought about her mother burning photographs in the fireplace to protect them. She thought about Carlos, her brother, who was waiting for her letter on the other side of the world. She thought about all the years of silence and all the nights spent mopping floors while the music screamed inside her hand. Then she began to play. She did not play Chopin this time. Instead, she played a tango, one of the old songs her grandfather used to play in the dance halls of Buenos Aires. It was not the kind of music these fancy people were used to hearing, but Maria did not care. This was her music, the music of her homeland, the music of her heart. The notes were playful and sad at the same time, full of longing and joy and the particular melancholy of people who have lost everything but keep dancing anyway. Maria played, and for the first time in 40 years she felt completely alive. The audience sat in stunned silence at first because they had expected something classical and refined, but as the music continued they began to understand what they were hearing. This was not just a performance. It was a confession, a prayer, a love letter to everyone Maria had lost. When she finished, the last note hung in the air like a held breath. For a moment there was absolute silence, then the room exploded. People leaped to their feet, applauding and cheering and crying. Victor was openly sobbing, making no effort to hide his tears. Elena had her hands pressed to her face and was shaking with emotion. Even the oldest and most dignified guests were on their feet, clapping until their hands hurt. Maria sat at the piano and let the waves of applause wash over her. She was crying too, but she was also smiling. For the first time in 40 years she was not Maria the cleaning woman, she was Maria Elena Vasquez. She had finally come home. 6 months after the charity gala, Maria Elena Vasquez stood in the wings of the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires. She could hear the murmur of the audience on the other side of the curtain. 3,000 people waiting to see the prodigy who had disappeared 40 years ago. Her hands were shaking and her heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst out of her chest, but she was not afraid. She was ready. So much had changed in the months since that night in Vienna when Victor Harman too had mocked her, and she had finally found the courage to play again. The video of her performance at the charity gala had spread even further than the first one. Television shows and newspapers from every country had told her story, and people who had known her as a child had come forward to share their memories. She had received thousands of letters from people all over the world, people who had been inspired by her story, people who had their own hidden talents and secret dreams. She could not read them all, but she read as many as she could, and each one reminded her that she was not alone. Carlos had flown to Vienna 2 weeks after receiving her letter. When he walked into her tiny apartment and saw his little sister for the first time in 40 years, he had collapsed into her arms, weeping like a child. They stayed up all night talking about everything, about their father and their mother and the terrible years after they fled Argentina. Carlos told her that he had spent decades searching for information about their father. He had gone to government offices and human rights organizations and archives that were opened after the military regime fell. He had finally learned the truth. Their father, Alejandro, had been killed just 3 days after he was taken, shot by soldiers and buried in an unmarked Maria. Elena had cried when she heard this, cried for the father she had lost and the years she had spent hoping he might somehow still be alive. But there was also a strange peace in knowing the truth. She could finally stop waiting and start mourning. Carlos had also brought something else with him to Vienna, a small wooden box that had belonged to their mother. Inside the box were photographs that Rosa had not burned, photographs she had kept hidden in case her children ever needed them. There was a picture of Alejandro on his wedding day, young and handsome with hope in his eyes. There was a picture of Maria Elena at her first piano recital, 6 years old in a pink dress. There was a picture of the whole family together at a birthday party with cake and candles and smiles. Maria Elena had held these photographs to her chest and felt her heart break and heal at the same time. The invitation to perform at the Teatro Colón had come a month after the gala. Theater was holding a memorial concert for victims of the dirty war, and they wanted Maria Elena to be the featured performer. At first, she had said no because the thought of returning to Buenos Aires was too painful, but then she thought about all the other families who had lost loved ones during those terrible years. She thought about the thousands of people who had disappeared and were never found. She thought about her father, who had died because he believed in justice and freedom. She could not bring him back, but she could honor his memory. She could play for him one last time. Victor Harmon had paid for her flight and her hotel because he wanted to be part of her journey back to the light. He had changed so much in the past 6 months. Humbled by his mistakes and hungry to become a better person and a better musician, Maria had forgiven him completely, and they had become unlikely friends. He was sitting in the front row tonight along with Elena, who had come to Buenos Aires on a scholarship funded by the Gala. Carlos was there too with his wife and children, Maria, Elena's nieces and nephews, whom she was only now getting to know. The stage manager appeared at her elbow and told her it was time. Maria. Elena took a deep breath and smoothed down the front of her dress. It was white, like the dress she had worn at her last concert here 40 years ago. She had chosen it deliberately as a way of connecting her past and her present. She walked onto the stage and the audience rose to their feet before she had even reached the piano. They were applauding and crying, and some of them were holding photographs of their own lost loved ones. Maria Elena stood in the center of the stage and looked out at the sea of faces while she saw old people who remembered her as a child and young people who had only heard of her through the videos. She saw families who had suffered like hers and survivors who had rebuilt their lives from nothing. She saw her country, wounded but still standing, still hoping, still alive. She bowed deeply and then walked to the piano and sat down. The applause faded into silence and the concert hall held its breath. Maria Elena placed her hands on the keys and thought about everything that had led her to this moment. She thought about the little girl who had climbed onto a piano bench at 3 years old and changed her own destiny. She thought about the teenager who had stood on this very stage and made audiences weep. She thought about the woman who had mopped floors and kept her music locked away and convinced herself she was nobody. She thought about Victor and Elena and Carlos and all the people who had helped her find her way back, and she thought about her father Alejandro, who had loved music and loved justice and loved his family more than anything in the world. Remember the music, he had told her. Remember who you are. She remembered now. She knew exactly who she was. Maria Elena Vasquez began to play. She played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the same piece she had been preparing for the concert that never happened 40 years ago. The music filled the teatro Colon and spilled out into the streets of Buenos Aires, where people had gathered to listen through the open doors. It traveled across the city and across the country and across the ocean to Vienna, where a recording was being broadcast live. It reached everyone who had ever felt lost and hopeless and forgotten. It told them that it was never too late to find your way home. Maria Elena played and the tears streamed down her face, but she did not stop. She played for her father, who had believed in her and died for what he believed in. She played for her mother, who had sacrificed everything to keep her children safe. She played for Carlos and for Elena and for all the young musicians who were only beginning their journeys. She played for Victor, who had been cruel and then been brave enough to change. She played for herself, for the girl she had been and the woman she had become. When the last note faded, the silence lasted for a long moment. Then the audience erupted in the loudest applause Maria Elena had ever heard. People were on their feet screaming and crying and hugging each other. Victor was sobbing openly and Elena was jumping up and down, and Carlos had his face buried in his hands. Maria Elena stood up from the piano and faced the audience. He placed her hand over her heart and bowed, and somewhere in that audience, somewhere in the sound of 3,000 people applauding, she could swear she heard her father's voice. Well done, he seemed to say. Well done, my darling Gerling Gel. Maria Elena smiled through her tears and bowed again. She was home at last. She was finally home, and the music would never be silent again.